The amygdala is a structure deep in the temporal lobe. Two clusters of neurons no larger than the tip of a thumb, one on each side of the brain. It fires in roughly 12 milliseconds. The conscious mind catches up at 300 to 500. In the gap between those numbers, the work of 2,000 years of philosophy and 4 decades of neuroscience converges on a single small problem of emotional regulation. By the time you've decided how to feel about an insult, you've already felt it, and a flicker of that feeling has moved across your face. That flicker is what trained observers learn to read. Brain scans of long-term meditators and FBI hostage negotiators show measurable structural changes in the circuit responsible for it. The training that produces those changes is, it turns out, what the Stoics were doing 2,000 years before instruments existed to confirm it. The amygdala is older than language. It existed in lizards and rodents, tens of millions of years before our line diverged into anything recognizable as primate. Whatever else you are, this part of you is not human in any modern sense. The structure stayed because in the world it evolved for, it worked in a world without writing or cities, where strangers couldn't be trusted to cooperate. Survival depended on pattern matching, faster than thought could move. The rustle in the grass had to be processed before the conscious mind could ask whether it was snake or the wind. This is what neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux calls the low road. The amygdala became the part of you that asks first and explains later. It has saved more lives than the cortex ever has, and continues to do so. The problem is that the modern world contains very few snakes, and the alarm has been redirected almost entirely toward the social arena. What it now treats as a predator is the look on another person's face. When the insult arrives, the amygdala doesn't wait for your opinion. The cascade is automatic. Within milliseconds, cortisol enters the bloodstream, and the heart begins to work faster. Pupils widen by a fraction of a millimeter. The skin around the eyes shifts in ways that register on a high frame rate camera. All of this happens before your prefrontal cortex. The deliberate part of you has even been consulted on the matter. This is what Daniel Kahneman would call System 1 thinking, fast, automatic, and beyond conscious control. This sequence is the source of the leak. A trained observer reads it before you've spoken, registering the small tightening of the eyebrows and the slight shift of the jaw. Paul Ekman, working at the University of California in the 1970s, gave the leak a name. He called it a microexpression. The proof in his work was that human beings broadcast their internal state in pulses lasting a 40th of a second, and that other people without training register those pulses unconsciously. We don't need to know what we've seen. The body simply registers that the person across the table has been hit. Most of what we call intuition about other people is the conscious mind catching up to data. The unconscious has already collected. When you say you don't trust someone, what you mean is that your face has already been reading their face and the report came back negative before you could articulate why. The reverse is also true. Other people are reading you in real time without knowing they're reading you and without being able to explain what they've read. They walk away from the conversation knowing where you're weak. The information has been transferred without either party signing for it. For most of human history, this transfer was useful. The leak said, "I am wounded, do not press me further," or "I am angry, retreat." In a tribe of 30 people where every face was familiar and every conflict had to end by sundown, the leak kept the peace. It was a survival signal evolved for a world in which reading and being read were both necessary and cooperation depended on it. In a corporate room, the leak is information your opponent can't pay enough money to obtain, and you give it to them for free. This is the problem. The elite have been quietly solving for 2,000 years. They knew nothing about microexpressions or about the chemistry that produced them. What they knew was that the men who ruled longest were the men who couldn't be read. They began training the symptom, not the cause. The practice was built before the mechanism was understood. Stoicism saw the situation most clearly. Epictetus, born a slave, crippled by a master who broke his leg in a fit of rage, said that it isn't events that disturb us, but our judgments about events. He didn't mean this as a comfort, but as a technical instruction. The judgment occurs after the event, in the gap between the firing of the amygdala and the rising of the response. That gap is small by modern measurement. It's about 300 milliseconds wide. It's also wide enough to live inside. Marcus Aurelius, writing notes to himself in a campaign tent on the Danube, returned to this idea repeatedly. "You have power over your mind," he wrote, "not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wasn't telling himself something he had already mastered, but something he was still trying to master, in the privacy of a journal he never expected anyone to read. The practice from the inside is not a state, but a rehearsal that doesn't end. Even the emperor of Rome, who could have any man in the empire killed for a glance, sat with a tablet at night and reminded himself, again, that the senator who insulted him at lunch did not have authority over his interior. The reminder was necessary because he wasn't above it. Like a craftsman, he worked in the dark. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius, gave the practice a different name. He called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. Each morning before opening his eyes, Seneca would rehearse the insults and losses the day might bring. Not because he expected them, but because he wanted his amygdala to have already met the imagined version of the wound by the time the real version arrived. The first time the brain feels something, it learns. By the second exposure, it remembers. Seneca's nervous system had already practiced the response by the time the actual provocation arrived. The provocation found a man who had been waiting for it. There is a reason the Roman elite carried small notebooks for this exercise into their old age. The work didn't end because the work was the point. Stoicism understood, 2,000 years before instruments could measure it. That emotional control isn't the absence of feeling. The discipline is the deliberate refusal to broadcast the feeling. Arousal still happens internally. The body's chemistry shifts as it always has. What changes is only what the world sees on your face and in the small movements of your hands. The Greek word for this was apatheia, usually translated as freedom from passion, though a closer translation is freedom from being moved. Wind blows through a tree, and the roots hold. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm what they were doing. In 2005, a team of researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital ran structural MRI scans on long-term meditators and compared their brains to age-matched controls. The meditators had measurably thicker gray matter in the prefrontal cortex and reduced volume in the right amygdala. They hadn't just changed their behavior. They had remodeled the tissue. 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, in subsequent studies was enough to begin producing this change. The brain isn't a fixed instrument. It's a muscle that adapts to what's asked of it. What was being asked of it in those studies was the same thing Epictetus had asked of his students. Sit still while the impulse arises, and let it pass without action. Negotiators are a different kind of case. At Quantico, the FBI's crisis negotiation unit trains its agents in what they call tactical empathy and emotional regulation. The training is brutal in the way that only genuinely useful training is brutal. Trainees are placed in simulated standoffs where actors scream at them while watching their faces. The trainee's job is to feel everything and reveal nothing. Indifference is not the standard, only a face that shows what the negotiator has decided to show. When researchers have scanned these agents during high-stress simulations using functional MRI, they've observed a specific pattern. The prefrontal cortex remains active while the amygdala fires without taking command, and the voice on the audio track doesn't change. Activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, measured by amplitude, correlates with how successful the agent was in the negotiation. They've learned, in the most literal possible sense, to keep the signal local. The wound is felt internally but doesn't leave the body. Chris Voss, who led the FBI's international hostage negotiation work for 15 years, has said publicly that he never met a senior negotiator who couldn't, when pressed, identify the exact moment they had given up, trying to feel less, and started trying to feel everything without showing it. The shift happened in most cases around the third or fourth real deployment. Before that, they were trying to be unmoved. Afterward, they were moved entirely and trained the body to keep the moving inside. The faces became still because the men behind them had stopped trying to make the faces still. They were now trying to do something else, and the stillness was a side effect of the deeper work. This is the entire skill. Not numbness, but containment. The reason the skill matters outside of negotiation rooms and meditation cushions is that every visible reaction in your daily life is intelligence you're giving away for free. Your anger reveals what you fear. Defensiveness exposes where you feel weak. The enthusiasm you show broadcasts what you can be made to chase. The man who flinches when criticized has just told the room that the criticism reached something soft. Whoever in the room wants leverage over him now knows where to aim. The salary negotiation that you walked into confident and walked out of with $5,000 less than the company would have paid wasn't lost because they were better. It was lost because somewhere between the offer and the counteroffer, your face told them how much you wanted the job. The relationship that ended because you couldn't stop reacting to comments designed to provoke you didn't end because the comments were unbearable. It ended because the person making them learned, every time you reacted, exactly which lever produced, which sound they were running an experiment, and you were giving them their data. This is what happens in the rooms you can't see. The hiring manager has been running the same conversation with 12 other candidates this quarter, and his unconscious is calibrated. He isn't consciously hunting for your weakness. The amygdala is doing the work. When you say a number, his face produces a microexpression, and yours produces one in response to his. The two of you are running a conversation neither of you is fully aware of. and the result is determined less by the words exchanged than by the tells exchanged underneath them. The candidate who walked in with control of his face hadn't memorized clever lines. He'd spent years learning to keep one signal from leaving his body. The interview was decided in the first 90 seconds. In a layer of communication neither participant could have transcribed. This is why the question of how to stop caring what others think is the wrong question. You won't stop caring. The amygdala won't let you stop caring. Social rejection registers in a region of the brain called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the activation pattern is nearly identical to the pattern produced by physical pain. Naomi Eisenberger and Matthew Lieberman demonstrated this at UCLA in 2003 using a virtual ball-tossing game called Cyberball when participants were excluded from the game. The same neural circuits that fire when you stub your toe began to fire. The brain doesn't have a separate department for being left out of a group chat. It uses the same machinery it uses for an actual injury. When someone humiliates you in public, the brain processes it the way it processes a burn. You can't decide to stop feeling burned. The skill isn't to turn off the receptor, but to refuse to dance to it. In follow-up work, Eisenberger's group showed that taking acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, reduced activation of the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex during social rejection. A painkiller for a stubbed toe reduced the brain's response to being excluded. The two phenomena aren't metaphorically related. They're mechanically the same. When someone in a meeting talks past you, your brain is treating it the way it treats a small physical injury. The injury isn't imaginary, it's just sourced from words instead of nails. Knowing this is the first step toward the work, because once you understand that the wound is real, you can stop pretending you don't have it. Someone who pretends he isn't wounded is wounded twice. The person who knows he's wounded and decides not to broadcast it is choosing rather than pretending. This is what the channels selling self-help don't understand. They tell you to let go and stop caring, as if caring were a posture you could simply set down. Stoicism knew better. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, didn't stop caring what his enemies said about him. What he did with their insults was record them in his journal in order to look at them and refuse them entry. He cared. The caring was simply denied the privilege of running his face. There is a useful image for the underlying mechanism. The amygdala is the smoke alarm, and the prefrontal cortex is the firefighter in an untrained person. The smoke alarm is wired directly to the legs. The alarm goes off and the body either runs or attacks. In a trained person, the smoke alarm is wired to the firefighter. When the alarm goes off, the firefighter checks whether there's actually a fire and then decides how to respond. The ringing continues as loudly as it ever did. It has just lost its authority over the body. The firefighter has to be built, not given. Pathways that allow the prefrontal cortex to inhibit the amygdala are myelinated through repetition. The way a piano player's hands are built by repetition. There is no shortcut. The men who have it have done the work, in the quiet, for years. Most of them don't advertise the work. The discipline of not displaying what they feel extends to not displaying that they have trained themselves not to display what they feel. You won't catch them telling you about their morning routine. The work shows up, instead, in the texture of their silences. What the work looks like in practice is not dramatic. It looks like 4 kinds of repetition. Breath comes first, specifically the deliberate slowing of the exhale. The vagus nerve, which runs from the brainstem down through the chest and into the gut, is the body's primary parasympathetic regulator. When the exhale is longer than the inhale, the vagus nerve sends a slowing signal to the heart. The heart slows and the cortisol release dampens. Through a feedback loop that is still being mapped, the amygdala receives a signal that the threat has passed. Box breathing, used by Navy SEAL teams since the late 1980s, is the simplest version. The pattern is a 4-second inhale followed by a 4-second hold, then a 4-second exhale, and a 4-second hold to close the cycle, in the gap between an insult and a reply. That single cycle is enough to reroute the signal. The man who can hold 1 cycle of box breathing during a hostile question has, by that act alone, separated himself from most of the population. Cold is the second practice. The morning shower turned to its lowest setting for 90 seconds, or the lake in November. Cold exposure, popularized by methods like the Wim Hof method, activates the same vagal pathway and trains the system to tolerate the spike of adrenaline without behavioral collapse. Men who have stood in ice water for 2 minutes a day for 6 months have a different relationship with provocation. They've proven to their nervous system, in a context where the stakes are low, that the body can endure the alarm without obeying it. The lesson generalizes. When the boss raises his voice in the meeting, the body recognizes the sensation. It's been here before, and nothing happened. The third practice is sitting. 20 minutes of stillness, with the eyes closed and attention placed on the breath. Each time the mind wanders, attention returns to the breath. The practice isn't mysticism. It's the deliberate strengthening of the attentional circuit between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Each time the attention wanders and is brought back, the firefighter is doing one repetition. After several thousand repetitions, the firefighter has measurable mass. The Massachusetts General Hospital studies measured this directly. Gray matter density in the left hippocampus increased after 8 weeks, while density in the right amygdala decreased. The structure of the brain changed because of what the brain had been asked to do. The fourth is exposure. Deliberately enter situations where you'll be insulted or dismissed and remain in them without retaliating. This is the hardest of the four because it can't be done alone. Stoicism knew this. The school sought out opponents and difficult students. Cato the Younger wore unfashionable clothes specifically to draw mockery in the Roman streets. He went barefoot in the rain. The senators laughed at him for it, Plutarch records, and Cato was content to be laughed at, because what he was practicing wasn't eccentricity. He was paying for the lesson with his pride, in small doses, so that when a much larger insult arrived from a political rival or a soldier, the lesson would already be paid for. In the modern sense, he was training the gap. The Roman Senate didn't know what to do with a man who couldn't be insulted into a mistake. There is a less famous Stoic exercise that does similar work. The school of Musonius Rufus taught it in the 1st century: eat one meal a day, without seasoning. Sleep on the floor for 1 week of each season. The clothes you wear should mark you, if they mark you at all as someone of lower rank than you actually hold. The aim wasn't asceticism, it was the construction of a man whose comfort no one else could remove, because he had already removed it himself. When the actual blow arrived, whatever form it took, the man had already lived through a smaller voluntary version of it. The amygdala, presented with the threat, recognized the pattern and produced a smaller alarm. This is what the Romans meant by exercitatio. Not exercise in the modern sense, but the deliberate repeated rehearsal of being unmade. They were paying down the debt before it was called together. The 4 practices: remodel the system, not quickly and not overnight. The structural changes that researchers see in long-term meditators, the changes in amygdala volume and prefrontal density, take years, but the behavioral changes begin almost immediately. Within 2 weeks of beginning the practice, most people can hold a single breath cycle in the face of an insult. By the 2nd month, they can hold the silence long enough that the other person fills it. The silence once held is the most powerful tool in the room. When you don't react, the person who was trying to provoke you experiences something they didn't budget for. The absence of the response they expected is what they feel. The space that should have contained your anger or your hurt is empty, and the silence in that space isn't neutral. It's interrogative, asking them, without saying anything, why they felt the need to provoke you in the first place. You've done nothing, and yet the conversation has tilted. The status they were trying to establish over you hasn't been granted. They will fill the silence themselves, almost always with an explanation or a softening of the original tone. The amygdala in their brain has now begun to fire. They're leaking what they wanted you to leak. The dynamic has reversed. This is the asymmetry that the men who study power have always understood. The reactor occupies the lower status position in any exchange, while the non-reactor occupies the higher one. Not because he's impervious. The non-reactor is wounded and knows it, and the decision he made in the small gap between the firing of the amygdala and the rising of the response was that the wound would not be made public. That decision is the only thing separating the man who is red from the man who is not. There is a side note worth making, though it doesn't fit cleanly into the line of argument. The people who go furthest in this work are usually not the ones who started because they wanted power over others. They're usually the ones who started because they were tired of being controlled by their own reactions. The training in their telling was an attempt to recover something that felt lost, not to acquire something new. Any effect it had on others, in making them harder to manipulate and harder to read, was a side effect they noticed only later. Whether that distinction matters in practice is unclear. The amygdala is rewired the same way regardless of motive. The discipline is often misunderstood by people who haven't built it. From the outside, the trained man looks unmoved, perhaps even cold, and the temptation is to imagine that he's stopped feeling or armored himself against the world. The opposite is closer to the truth. Trained men feel every tremor the untrained feel, more sharply, because their attention is more refined. What the work has changed is what the tremor is permitted to do once it arrives. The internal experience isn't numbness, but the sensation of holding a great deal in a small place, deliberately, without spilling. There is one detail people miss about Stoicism, and it matters here. The Stoics weren't telling each other to be cold. Marcus Aurelius wept when his children died, and Seneca's letters to his wife were tender beyond what his political reputation suggested. The discipline wasn't about feeling less. It was about controlling the channel between feeling and broadcasting. The internal world remained vivid, while the external one received only what the man chose to send. This, in the practical sense, is what emotional control comes down to. The feeling is permitted to move through, while the broadcasting remains a decision. The men who can decide are the men whose authority doesn't depend on volume. They don't need to raise their voice because their face is already saying what they want it to say, and not what their amygdala wants it to say. The distance they've placed, perhaps no more than 300 milliseconds wide, sits between the smoke and the alarm. Inside that distance is everything Stoicism ever wrote about, and everything the negotiators and meditators have collectively learned. The rest of us live without that distance. We pay for the absence of it every day in salaries. We didn't negotiate well, and in relationships where the people closest to us learned which buttons to press long before we knew we had any buttons at all. At Quantico, the training continues. Replications of the Massachusetts General Imaging Study have appeared in the literature several times since 2005, in different populations with similar results. The number of adults who complete 8 weeks of sustained attention in any given year remains small.